to Our Town. Dorothy Thompson speaking to you today from the Brewer Public Library grounds where, look, there are signs of spring. And here in the front there are the raised gardening beds. Gardening, it's on the minds of many. Library is a wonderful place. It offers many programs, including the recent one by Bjorn Bergman about seed saving and a seed swap. We'll take a look at that right now.
We'll get started, everybody. Welcome today. I'm excited to be here. My name's Bjorn Bergman. I live in Viroqua, so just a little ways up the road. And I'm just really excited to be here. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. I have no affiliation to any group. I'm just doing this out of excitement. One thing that I do want to point out, though, is I guess I do have affiliation to a group. Wisconsin Farmers Union is supporting this. I've been doing this presentation. Now this is the third straight Saturday that I've been doing this. I've done one at Viroqua, one at La Crosse last weekend, and then on the 16th we did one in Valley as well. And so we got a grant from the Wisconsin Farmers Union to go around and do these talks about seed saving and also host seed swaps. And Dylan from the Farmers Union, he's running a little bit late today, but he'll be here later. He has seeds to share as well, and he'll give a little spiel about the Farmers Union. But I just want to thank all of these organizations and libraries that have kind of been supporting this sort of circuit. And before I start, I just want to share a little bit about me. I love to grow things. During college, I got interested in vegetable farming, and I worked at a couple different vegetable farms in Wisconsin, one over near Lake Michigan in Plymouth, Wisconsin, and then another one up in Bluff, Wisconsin as well, northwestern Wisconsin. And I moved to Viroqua in the fall of 2009, and at that point I'd never grown a garden on my own before. I just had farmers saying plant that now and weed that now, and it was a good learning experience to finally have my own spot to grow things. This is a picture of my wife Heidi and I. This is a rental that we had in Viroqua, and the landlord just let us rip up the front yard and do whatever we wanted with it. And then since then, we own a house just a little bit off Main Street, and the main reason that I wanted the house is because I had a south-facing backyard that was all grass and no trees, and so now it's just a mix of annual vegetables and perennial fruits and apple trees and peach trees and stuff like that. And then about a mile from downtown Viroqua in a hayfield, I have some friends that just have a 7-acre hayfield, and they let me make little parcels for seed production, food production all around. And I love growing things, so I kind of came into this just wanting to grow my own food and have interest in that. And it kind of just led me down this rabbit hole of asking this question of where do my seeds come from? How do you actually save your own seeds? And it kind of got me to where I am today, is just kind of continually asking questions, being interested in stuff, and talking to other people, learning from organizations. And so I'm excited to be here today to kind of share a lot of what I've learned with other folks and hopefully answer some questions. But yeah, today I'm going to talk about all of these topics. What is a seed? The history of seeds in the United States, who owns seed, how to save seeds for beans, peas, and tomatoes. And this is, in the seed saving section, it's really meant to be a very beginner level, and I picked some very easy crops to do it from to kind of make it more simple. There's some crops that are really difficult to save seeds from and require more land, more information, more resources. And so if folks want to talk about those after, we can. And then yeah, I have some seed-saving resources, and that's about it. And a little bit more about me too. I graduated from University of Wisconsin La Crosse with a degree in biology and chemistry, so I kind of like nerd out a little bit on the biology aspect, but I recognize that not all people are interested in that part of it, and so I'll try to not go too deep into that stuff. But yeah, the simple stuff today. What is a seed? And I included this picture of this variety called Tiger's Eye on this page, because that's the first seed that really got me thinking about this question about how seeds are produced. I was in Madison helping a nonprofit clean up a school garden in 2011, and one of the other volunteers started coming over to me with these dried bean pods and being like, whoa, look at these cool beans, and one of them was this variety, and I was just kind of like blown away at the beauty and the color. And it's funny, I had never thought about like how you actually grow dry beans before. I'd never like thought about that process. And so I ended up cracking a bunch of these pods open with kids at recess, and then I ended up taking all the beans home and planting them in my garden, and that was my first foray into the seed saving. But so scientifically, what is a seed? It's a flowering plant's unit of reproduction, and it's capable of developing into another such plant. We know we take these little tiny typically hard things and plant them in the ground, and they just kind of magically transform. All the information's there to become this amazing plant that grows food for us. They're pretty amazing things. And there's some other definitions here of what seeds are. But one important point that I want to share with you is that seeds are alive. We can't just save them and keep them in jars and come back 20 years later and expect them to germinate and grow. They need to be regrown. Sometimes they will germinate after 20 years. But it's important to keep growing them and saving seeds from them, because if you don't do that, then we'll lose specific varieties. And one thing that I think is really important about seeds, and what makes me excited about them, is that seeds are really rooted in culture. If we go back even 100 years from now, there weren't really that many seed companies around at that point. And when people farmed or gardened, they also saved seeds. And when people moved and emigrated and changed what country they live in, a lot of times they brought seeds with them. And they brought those seeds with them because they either tasted delicious, they had some sort of historical relevance in their family, and they wanted to, maybe their great-great-grandmother had grown and saved this variety, and they want to keep saving it and pass it down through generations. And so I really think that's fascinating. A really important thing is that without the people, a lot of these varieties won't exist, because there has to be the people involved of saving them and sharing them for them to continue. And then just a few definitions here, and this might be all information that you already know, but I want to just touch on it. What is a plant variety? So a plant variety represents a precisely defined group of plants selected within a species with a common set of characteristics. Lots of words there, but I guess the best example here is, let's just compare two tomato varieties. They're both tomatoes, they're both the same species. So the first one is Sun Gold cherry tomato. If you guys have gone to the farmer's market, you probably had these cherry tomatoes before. They're orange. They're the most sweet tomatoes you've ever had in your whole entire life, and they crack really easy. They're quite delicious. And then on the other end of the spectrum with tomatoes is Speckled Roman. This is a red tomato with yellow stripes. It's typically a paste tomato that's used for making salsa and sauce and whatnot. And they're very different, but they are the same species. They're both tomatoes. And why this is important is because each of these different varieties, people have saved and kept them isolated from each other because these traits are important to them, and they want to kind of keep them pure and want to keep them going onward. And the other important thing is there's a huge diversity of different varieties to choose from, and tomatoes are the most popular garden crop in the United States. And so there's a lot of different varieties. Do any of you have a guess how many different tomato varieties you have access to?
500.
Did you say 500 or
2,000.
higher than 2,000?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, over double that.
Wow.
The best guess right now is 5,500 different varieties of tomatoes. And if you counted all of the tomato varieties that aren't in the seed catalogs, that people are just saving seeds for because they're handed down from generation to generation, it'd be even more than that. And there's actually a very big group of like tomato enthusiasts that breed tomatoes at home, so there's even more varieties.
How many aren't owned by Monsanto?
There's a lot.
Good.
There's
Okay.
a lot, but there are some. And then some other terminology that we want to get straight here too is open pollinated seeds. And these are seeds that will grow true to type if you save them. So if you say like take a Cherokee purple tomato, you grow it, you save seeds, it's an open pollinated variety. You're going to get the same seed next year. Another term that is used a lot that I just want to have a definition for is heirloom seeds. And so heirloom seeds are a type of open pollinated seed that's been handed down from generation to generation. And typically people limit that by being 50 or more years that it's been handed down amongst people. Because that's kind of a buzzword in the seed world, is heirloom seeds, this and that, but that's kind of a constraint around it. Another thing to keep in mind is hybrid seeds, and I won't try to bore you too much about this, but hybrid seeds don't produce seeds that are true to type. So if you take that sun gold cherry tomato that's a hybrid, if you save seeds from that, it's not going to be the same tomato the next year.
Well, you'll still get tomatoes from it, though, right?
Yes.
More likely.
Yeah. So if you just are like want to have success with keeping the same variety, only save seeds from open pollinated varieties. If you want to have a science experiment and see lots of diversity, you can save seeds from some hybrids. And I just have this here because a lot of people ask what a hybrid is, but a hybrid is when you take two dissimilar parents, so this is maybe a smaller, more compact pea and a bigger, larger pea, and you cross them together. I don't know if many of you guys remember Mendel's genetics with dominant and recessive traits, big A, little a. That first generation, the F1 hybrid, you're only going to get dominant traits. You're going to get your big A traits that show up. And if you save seed from that F1 hybrid, you'll start seeing your recessive traits. And I've done this before. I've started breeding crops before. And the F2 generation, you just get this spectacular explosion of diversity. But you don't get the same thing that you started with. So, yeah, if you want a science experiment, you can go with hybrids, but stick to open pollinated varieties if you kind of want initial success. And then the last few things that I want to point out here that I think are important is that seeds are really the foundation of agriculture. Obviously, if we don't have seeds, we can't plant our gardens, we can't plant our fields. And it's really the foundation of our food system, and if we want a sustainable food system, we need a sustainable seed system. And then the other piece that I think is important, whoever controls our seed controls the food system and what crops are produced. And so that's the end of just like the basic about what is seeds. And I'm going to have a brief tangent right now. One thing that I love about seeds is the stories that come with them as well. And so I want to tell you a story about this bean, this dry bean that I have right here. It's called Donna Gardner beans. And I brought this one kind of into my seed collection on accident. I was looking for straw to mulch my garden, and I ended up getting in touch with this farmer outside of Roquo, Orvin Gardner. And I was up in his hayloft throwing hay bales out of his hayloft because he was just a little too old. And my wife Heidi was talking to him, and he was like, "Oh, do you want to go see my garden?" And she said, "Yeah." And he took her over to see his garden. And then he said, "Oh, those are Donna's beans." My wife Donna, who had passed away at that time, her great-great-grandmother brought them over from England in the 1920s. And do you want some? And so he went in his house and came out with a pill bottle and gave me these, and I've been growing them since. And I just think it's great to kind of have that history, because when I look at these, I see that history of all the other people in the past that have saved them and handed them down from generation to generation. And so I have some pictures of kind of them growing out in the field. The flower looks like that. The green beans aren't really edible. This is a shelling bean. When the beans get bigger in the green pods, you can shell them, or you can wait until they're dry and clean them as well. They're a pretty good dry bean as well. But yeah, I just wanted to have that kind of brief interlude to kind of share one of those stories, because what I love about it, I love the science aspect of seed saving, but I also love the history as well, and telling those stories and the community it builds with sharing them amongst people. Okay, now I will try to make this section short, but I could do a whole entire presentation on this section. So I'm going to talk about the history of seeds in the United States and kind of like how we got to where we are now, and why seed saving is important. But before we talk about that, I think a really important thing to think about that's really fascinating to me is, let's rewind pre-1492 and Europeans crossing the Atlantic to the Americas. And let's think about what crops people had in their farming fields and their gardens. What were they eating? And so what crops were native to Europe at that time? And you guys can just yell them out if you want to.
Turnips?
Turnips, yeah.
Okay.
Potatoes.
Not potatoes.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
No. I'll just go through some of them right now. Apples, cabbage, asparagus, canola, mustard seeds. So a lot of the brassica family plants, carrots, beets, peas, olives, leeks, hops, hazelnuts. And so what fascinates me about this is, like, when you say potatoes, like, we think like European culture is just like intertwined with this crop, and it's not actually from Europe at all. And pre-1492, they didn't have potatoes there to eat. And so then we go on to this other list. What crops are native to the Americas? What do the indigenous people in the Americas have over here? And some of you can yell them out. You're going to say potatoes right away.
Corn. Yeah.
Corn. I'll go through them, but a lot of the nightshades,
Squash.
peppers, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, corn, sunflowers, blueberries, strawberries, cranberries, grapes. Think about wine. If grapes are native to the Americas. That one always makes me laugh a little bit, because we think about wine being so European.
So there were no grapes in Europe before 1492-ish?
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Yeah.
Pumpkin, squash,
Have to tell
cotton,
that to
avocados.
Elaine.
Elaine, yeah.
And so I like to bring this up because, like, even think about tomatoes. If we think about tomatoes, we're just like, Italy, Italian food, like,
Yeah.
but they, colonists came over from Europe, interfaced with the indigenous people here and brought those seeds over, and they were bred and kind of accepted into the culture.
Well, when they talk about wine in the Bible, that wasn't made out of grape, it was made out of something
You
else.
can make wine out of anything,
Oh.
right? Right.
Yeah. Funny.
Yeah. So it's kind of crazy to think about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, there's cacao for chocolate as well.
Did we have limes and lemons, oranges?
I didn't put any of the citrus fruit on here. So my next slide is a good answer, and this is kind of a little bit blurry, but there's a group called the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, and they've kind of aggregated all of this information to roughly estimate the origins of different food crops. So it's really interesting. Like, even one of the more interesting ones to me that I'll just point out is watermelons from southern Africa. And we think about watermelon being quintessentially American, but like the history there is Africans being brought over on slave ships, bringing seeds with them. And so, yeah, there's a lot of dark history here too, but I think it's good to acknowledge like where things are actually coming from. And like, even when I talk about these like Donna Gardner beans, we saw that those are from the Americas. The reality is that Europeans came over, got beans, brought them back over to Europe, and then they hopped the Atlantic again. And so there's really kind of been this flow, and I think it's important to kind of recognize that our whole entire seed system is really built on this like indigenous foundation of seeds. Like, a lot of times we can tell kind of a very like white perspective about it, but it's important to talk about it.
Onions are European or are they American?
I think they're European.
Okay.
I should put onions in whatever group there.
Sweet potatoes are African or? South, aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're from somewhere in Africa.
Or south, at least.
Yeah, but check out the Center for
Okay, cool.
the Center for Tropical Agriculture has more. And so I just thought that was a really fun exercise to think about, like where our food comes from and how people, when they move, they bring seeds with them because they're culturally important. Is how they sustain themselves. And it kind of explains how food crops have gotten spread all over the whole entire globe because, yeah, seeds are some of the most important things that people brought with them when they moved around. And so when Europeans came to the Americas, obviously they brought their seeds with them. Some of them might have grown well, some of them might have not grown well, and then they see Native Americans that might be practicing some type of agriculture or hunting and gathering, and they either stole or traded seeds with them. Who knows? It's probably a mix of all of these things. And I already said this, but yeah, all of our whole seed system is kind of built on this indigenous foundation. That's just good to call out, and so it's good to kind of tell that whole story. And so now we're going to fast forward, and so the U.S. government saw there was a big gap in agriculture and people being able to feed themselves in a good way, and so they supported public seed in a lot of different ways in the past. And so the first way that they did this is in 1890 or 1839. The U.S. Patent Office created a government program to collect, characterize, and distribute free seed to farmers. And this was a really popular program because it helped farmers get varieties that tasted better, yielded higher, had more disease resistance. And in 1862, the USDA was formed, and a third of their budget was just devoted to this free seed program. And by 1900, 1 billion packets of free seed were sent out to farmers around the United States. It really created this foundation of kind of a public seed system in the U.S. And it enabled farmers to get new varieties and maybe even breed new varieties on their farms that were more adapted to the local conditions. And then the last piece that I won't talk about much, there's a bunch of different acts that were passed in the government to create land-grant universities and create extension services in the U.S. And these were a big piece of this was to breed public varieties that were adapted to different regions, and then distribute them. Hey Dylan. Hello. And get them out to farmers. And so it kind of created this fabric of the U.S. government supporting seed in that sort of way. And so things really started to change. One of the first organizations that wanted to see the end of the USDA free seed program was the American Seed Trade Association. They formed expressly to end that program because they saw that it was a barrier to private seed companies being able to make money from selling seeds. And so in 1924, they lobbied Congress to actually pass an act to end that program. And then this last 100 years of our history of seed in the U.S., things changed pretty drastically from farmers growing their own crops and also saving their own seeds to the introduction of private seed companies and a lot of different technology. And so it's just a couple important things. The first hybrid corn was developed in 1930, and private firms kind of started to concentrate more on hybrids because farmers couldn't save seed from them anymore. And so if a farmer started using hybrids, then they'd have to go back and buy the same seed from those folks. And that's what we see too with a lot of vegetables as well. But there are benefits to hybrids, like different disease resistance, potentially higher yielding, but it creates a problem when it comes to saving seeds.
But if you plant a hybrid, you'll still get something edible. If it's a hybrid pea, you'll get a pea that's probably edible, or maybe.
Some of them will be edible. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah. It's kind of a crapshoot every
Okay.
time you save seed from a hybrid and plant it.
Okay.
It's a fun project
Oh,
if
sure.
you're into that sort of stuff. And so, like I said, this really kind of changed this kind of paradigm that had existed where farmers were saving their own seeds. They were suddenly beholden to seed companies, and if a seed company decided to drop a variety that they really liked, a hybrid variety that they really liked, suddenly they didn't have access to it and needed to switch what they were growing. And so as these companies expanded, they kind of gained more relevance in the seed industry. And I won't talk that much about this, but for the longest time, the US government and the USDA were kind of against this idea of being able to patent seed varieties. And it wasn't until, I guess in 1930, they allowed asexually reproduced plants like bulbs and whatnot to be patented. But until the Plant Variety Protection Act and then the US Supreme Court case in 1980, that really kind of opened the floodgates of patenting varieties. And it allowed private seed companies to start to make a lot more money from their investments in certain things. And then also with the advent of genetically engineered seeds. And so at this time there's lots of consolidation within the industry. A lot of chemical companies start buying seed companies, and we start losing a lot of smaller regional seed companies. And with chemical companies and seed companies kind of consolidating together, when they develop genetically engineered seeds, a lot of them are just being resistant to chemicals like herbicides, so they can sell kind of them in tandem. And so the commercial agriculture today is often referred to the agrochemical seed industry, just because they're so intertwined with each other. And then just a brief piece on like who owns seeds. In 2018, 4 agrochemical seed companies account for over 60% of global seed sales. And if you want to dig more into this, Dr. Philip Howard, a professor at Michigan State University, kind of comes out with these maps every so often, kind of mapping how the seed system is connected. And so the big players here are Bayer, BASF, Corteva, and ChemChina are the big main owners. And then there's smaller chemical companies and seed companies that kind of fall under that. And in the last century, we've lost about 75% of our edible plant varieties. And so as these companies are trying to increase profits, things that might not sell well, they're trying to kind of make a one-size-fits-all for all regions for seeds. And that's why it's so important for folks to save their own seeds, to kind of maintain access to seeds that they want, and also kind of continue that history of having access to those varieties. So anyhow, I hope that was informative. But now we'll go into the meat and potatoes of how to save seeds from the 3 different crops: common beans, peas, and tomatoes. And to start out with, the important info that you need to know. The number one question you need to ask: what's your purpose of saving seeds? Is your purpose to learn how to do it and save seeds for yourself, and you're not really going to necessarily share them with other people? Then you don't need to know that much about the rest that I'm going to talk about. If your purpose of saving seeds is to preserve genetic maintenance of a variety, then it's more important to know the scientific aspects of it. And for me personally, like if you want to get into seed saving, I just say go for it. Don't worry about any of this stuff. You'll just learn more things as you go along, and maybe you'll have some things that cross with each other, but just don't worry about it right now. Just try it out. And that's kind of where I started with those beans I talked about. I got from a school garden. I just planted them. I knew nothing about any of this sort of stuff, and it all ended up working out for better or worse. Other important information to know about varieties is know the scientific name. And so if things have the same scientific name, likely they can cross with each other. So that's an important thing to know. Know if a crop is an annual or a biennial. So what that means is an annual, you'll plant the seed and you can get mature seed the same year. Biennials are crops that you have to plant the seed, have it grow, then it stays in the ground over the winter. You have to bring it into a root cellar, and then you have to replant it, and then have it grow a second year to flower and produce seed. I'm not going to talk about any biennials today because they're really complicated, but things like carrots, beets, onions, Cabbage, kale are all biennials and a lot harder to save seed from. So I'm just going to talk about annuals today, but it's good to know, like, if you're excited about saving seed from a particular crop, if it's an annual or a biennial. It's good to know if a crop has wet seeds or dry seeds. Wet-seeded crops are easier to save seed from in the Midwest where it's so humid and there's so much moisture. Dry-seeded ones are ones that when the seeds are mature, they're going to be in a dry pod. And so with the amount of rain and humidity we have here, there can be bigger problems with sprouting in the pods or lower seed quality as well. And then pollination of a crop too, if it's self-pollinating, if it typically just pollinates itself, the flowers, or if it's outcrossing, if it wants pollen from other flowers to come in and pollinate it. Everything I'm going to cover today is self-pollinating because I wanted it to be the easy stuff. But this is just some things to think about. And then the isolation distance, so the distance you need to have between plants of the same species to make them not cross with each other. And all the ones that I'm covering today are really short isolation distance because I wanted it to keep it pretty simple. So common beans, and as you can see, these are some of my favorite things to save seeds from, and they have quite a bit of a diversity. And so the majority of the pictures I'm showing today are this variety of black bean that I have. No idea what the variety is called, but I call it Bjorn's black beans. It's a bush black bean from that school garden where I originally got interested in seed saving. And so you'll plant the seeds around June 1st, I typically aim for, in Viroqua. And then it's a bush dry bean, and so this is a obscenely long row of them. I don't recommend growing this many of them. But we gotta cultivate them, and then they'll flower. There's pretty pink flowers, and then they'll get fertilized and form a green bean. And then if we just leave them in the field like we do with soybeans, the pods will dry up. You can see dry pods on this plant. And this is a kind of an important point. If it rained a lot at this point, when the pods were all dry like that, a lot of them would sprout in the pods. I got lucky this year. Didn't have that much problem with it raining during dry down. There's some years that it rains a lot and make it challenging. And then you end up getting these dried pods filled with these beautiful black beans. And I put this other picture here to kind of show the evolution of like having a green bean, having immature seeds in it, and kind of it going through that cycle of drying down. That's a different variety. And so on a small scale, you can just pull these pods off and clean them all by hand. I typically just pick all the pods off, which takes a lot of work. And then I throw them in a pillowcase, stomp on the pillowcase. The pod matter will rise to the top. I'll pull that off. The beans will sink to the bottom, end up with something like this. And then you pour it in front of a fan. You winnow it, and that will blow all the chaff, all the dirt out. And you'll end up, hopefully, with beans that look like that. Other tools that you can use for cleaning are things like this. There's screens with, I got this from Seed Savers in Decorah, but there's different diameter screens that you can put the beans in here and like let chaff fall through, so it's not quite as dusty. But that's kind of a quick photo tutorial on how to save bean seed. And so here's some of the information you need to know about them. Scientific names, Phaseolus vulgaris. It's an annual dry seeded, so that means it's important during seed dry down to keep an eye on the weather. It's self-pollinating. They typically don't cross with other varieties of beans. For your population size for variety maintenance, you need to save seeds from 5 to 10 plants. And for genetic preservation, 20 plants. And then your isolation distance is between 10 and 20 feet. Isolation distance can get complicated if you have like a big structure between two varieties. That can decrease it. If you're producing seed, say for like a commercial seed company, you might want to make that much larger just to make sure that it's a pure variety doesn't cross. But it's really hard to cross-pollinate beans. The insect needs to get very involved. Yeah, that's how you save seeds from beans. Peas are very similar. Although they don't cross with beans, the biggest difference is planting time for these. You can plant these much earlier in spring when the soil is much cooler. And so here's the peas sprouting. This is a pole snow pea that I was growing for seed savers, just for genetic preservation for them. And so we can see it growing on the trellis. And I think this picture is really interesting. You can see this flat snow pea pod, but you can see kind of the immature seeds starting to form inside there. And that's the edible point of this variety. But to get it to seed maturity, you're going to leave those pods on the plant. And so this is actually the same variety. You can see it swells up like a snap pea, but they're going to be they're not going to be good snap peas. There's going to be lots of strings in them at this point. Then you're going to leave them on the trellis. They're going to dry down, and then it's a similar cleaning process as dry beans. It'll just be earlier in the season. So typically, you'll be harvesting these dry seeds in like August or something like that, whereas with dry beans, it will be September, beginning of October when you're harvesting those. And you can clean them the same way if you have a lot of them with a pillowcase and threshing and winnowing them. Yeah, here's the important things. This is all the same information as common beans. So they're self-pollinating crops as well. They're annuals, dry-seeded, isolation distance of 10 to 20 feet. And so now we'll get into something that's much different, a wet-seeded crop, tomatoes, which many of you grow in your garden, and is usually a common one for people to try out as well, but it's a very different process. And so with tomatoes, again, you're going to want to start those inside, and so I typically start mine inside around April 15th under lights. And the goal is to plant my tomato plants around June 1st in pretty warm soil. And I mulch them pretty well, and then I'm not going to talk about trellising or anything like that. If you want to talk about trellising, you can come talk to me at the end of the end. And one important thing to note about tomato plants is they're typically self-pollinating. But it's important for the variety that you're saving seed for to be familiar with the flowering structure of the plant. And so this is a great example. And so here's the pollen producing part of the plant and the pollen receiving part. And so pollen needs to go from here, land on the stigma, to get it to pollinate and form fruit. Most modern tomatoes, seems like most hybrids today, that pollen accepting part, the stigma, is a lot more inserted inside the anthers, and so pollen just usually falls off the anthers right onto the stigma. This is an heirloom tomato, and the stigma is exerted, so it more easily crosses with things. I should actually have a picture of like a more contained flower versus this one. But so this variety, you most likely would need to have isolation distance a bit longer just to make sure that they don't cross. And so this is, all these pictures that I'm showing is an Italian heirloom paste tomato that I got from my friend Craig, who wrote this book. If you're really into tomatoes, I recommend this book. It talks about seed-saving epic tomatoes. He shared this variety from me. A guy in the U.S. shared it from him. His family is from Italy. So once the plants get bigger and the fruit forms and ripens in August, you collect a fruit from each plant, and then you just might juggle them for a little bit. You don't have to do that, but then when I let them sit for maybe 1 or 2 days inside, and then I'll cut them kind of across the equator to expose all these little seed cavities. And then you take the tomato, I'll get pictures of this for next year, you take the tomato and you just squeeze it and get all the seeds and the gel to fall into a jar. And the reason you're doing this is you ferment tomato seeds to get rid of the gel that's around the seeds, which is a germination inhibitor. And So here's a picture of me with a jar of tomato seeds that are ready to ferment. And here's a bunch of, this is when I was helping with a breeding project on tomatoes, which was a little too much for me. But you squeeze the tomatoes into the jar, and then you just let it, you can put a cloth over the top, and you let it ferment for 3 to 5 days until the gel layer of the seed is gone. And during that time, you want to swirl the jar, and viable seeds or good seeds are going to sink to the bottom of the jar. To clean them, you're going to add water to your seed gel fermenty pulp that usually doesn't smell so great at this time, but it's just part of the process. And you'll stir them. All of the good seeds will fall to the bottom, and you're just going to decant the jar. So you're going to pour off the jar until you just have seeds left, and you're going to do that 3 times, and you'll end up with really clean seed. And then you'll pour them in a colander and just spray them off, and then put them on a coffee filter to dry for a good week or something like that. I don't use paper towels because they stick to paper towels all the time. For some reason, coffee filters work a lot better. And yeah, so this fermenting process helps with germination and also can get rid of a couple seed-borne diseases as well. And then some basic tomato tips, solanum, lycopersicum. Dylan, did I get that right? Pretty good?
Pretty good.
Yeah, okay, sweet. It's an annual, oh, I said dry seeded down here, I meant wet seeded. It's self-pollinating, and the population size is the same as it is for common bean and peas. The population size for things that outcross like corn will get a lot larger and becomes a lot harder for gardeners to do. And then the isolation distance for tomatoes is between 10 and 50 feet, and why there's a bigger range there is because of what the flowers look like. So kind of being familiar with what your flowers look like for tomatoes is important. But all of this being said, I think 95% of the time tomatoes will not cross-pollinate, they'll just self-pollinate. And so if you love tomatoes and you're excited about seed saving, I say just go for it. Just throw caution to the wind and try it. Don't be worried about a lot of these things. If you want to get more nerdy and more precise about it, you can kind of come back to this stuff later. Seed saving resources that I want to share. Seed Savers Exchange is a great resource that we have pretty close to here in Decorah, Iowa. They're a nonprofit that's just dedicated to kind of preserving our garden heritage. This is their book on seed saving. It's called The Seed Garden. I know that a lot of libraries have copies. I'm not sure if Richland Center has one, but they're really great. All of this information that I'm talking about, all the technical information, so this is for cucumbers. Whenever you get to a crop, it will have all the technical information over here on the side. So if you want to learn about saving seeds from squash or corn or watermelon or cabbage or carrots, this is the first book I'd recommend to people to kind of dive into it a little bit more. Another great resource for learning about seeds and connecting with people, obviously I mentioned Seed Savers. The Seed Savers has this yearbook called The Exchange. Anyone from around the United States can list seeds that they save in here. There's also an online version that doesn't look like the white pages. But I list, I think, 25 different varieties in here that folks can request from me, and I get emails and letters in the mail all the time requesting different kinds of seeds that I save. And so this is just a great resource. If you're really interested in beans, you can find other people around the country that are really interested in dry beans and save seeds with, or share seeds with them. And then back to Seed Savers. Seed Savers has lots of great events and different resources. I know when I started getting really interested in seeds, my mom, who's a master gardener, and I went to their 3-day-long seed saving school that they hosted there. And that was a great resource. And then one last thing, someone asked me this question at one of the first presentations: how do I store my seeds? And so I added this slide in there. And one thing that I want to let folks know is that you don't need to purchase seeds every single year. A lot of times seeds will be good for 2 to 3 years after you purchase them. Not all, and it depends, but depends on the crop. Say like onion seeds, they don't have a very long shelf life and you need new ones every year. But tomatoes, I've heard of tomato seed lasting 20 years or something like that in good conditions. And so there's good tables you can find on the internet of the life of a seed. But the main things you want to do to increase how long your seeds are viable is 3 words to remember is cool, dark, and dry. So cool location, where it's dark, not exposed to light, and where it's dry. And in the best situation, all of these 3 variables would stay pretty consistent. It's kind of bad to kind of have an oscillation of these things. If you want to get nerdy about it, there's a formula. If you add the temperature plus the relative humidity, if it's less than 100, that's a great situation. For me, I just store all of my, like when I have larger amounts of seeds, I try to make sure that they're really dry. And then I put them in jars. If I'm worried about them being completely dry when I put them in jars, I'll take one of those like silica packets that you get with shoes or something like that, that absorbs water. And I'll just throw them in there. But I just take all of my regular seed packets that I buy from companies and I put them in a Rubbermaid tub that has a pretty securely fitting lid. And I find that that does a good job of kind of keeping those variables consistent. Yeah, and so that's all about seed saving. I think I just want to finish with one last story. Oh, Tom made it today. That's awesome. I want to just share one more seed story with you that I'm really excited about. It's this bean. It's one of my favorite culinary beans. When I first moved to Viroqua, I met this woman, Monique Hooker. She lived in DeSoto, and she was born in Brittany, France. And one of her favorite, like common French dish is cassoulet. It's a really rich dish. I think it has duck in it and pork and I forget there's one other meat in it. And then there's these white beans in there. And
what's not to like?
Yeah, what's not to like about this? It's a very rich dish with lots of cheese in it. But she was complaining that she was a very funny lady. She was very, very boisterous. I liked her a lot. She was complaining that everyone was using white beans or navy beans in their cassoulet around here. And so she had her brother mail her seeds from France. And it was kind of, at that point she started having some health problems and she couldn't plant them anymore. So she sent the seeds to me. And she got them from, there's a cooperative in the Tarbes region in France that grows these and sells them around the world. And I got 200 seeds from her. I planted this like 70-foot row of pole beans. And they're like the most smooth textured bean I've ever like eaten. They're super, super tasty. And so in 2021, I grew 130 bed feet of it on 8-foot trellises. And so here's some of the pictures of all the dried down pods. And this is a really late maturing variety. These pods are dry at the beginning of October, which is kind of right on the edge of her kind of getting worried about early frosts at that point. But I picked all these pods off and they just thresh and winnow super nice, and they're just a really great culinary bean. And I have those to share with people today too. But I just wanted to finish on that note because I feel like sharing those seed stories with the seeds is a really important part of sharing them with other folks. And so, yeah, that's the presentation today. Do you guys have any questions? Anything you're wondering about?
How do we contact you after this?
Yeah, okay.
Is there like a sub-club meeting in Viroqua or anything?
No.
Oh.
There's a couple things. Here's my contact information. I have no business cards, which is funny because I'm just doing this on my own. So there's my contact information. If you're like more interested in this, there's a Midwest Seed Growers listserv that I am part of. Dylan is part of it as well. And it's people around the Midwest that that are interested in saving seeds. A lot of them are interested, maybe have their own small seed companies.
You know, I bet if you looked around, you might find a rabbit, maybe even an Easter rabbit or an Easter basket this weekend. We hope you'll come back next week and every week to watch Our Town.